G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 10 of Australia's Day of National Shame, aka book reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall. Second part of the chapter, the attack on the aerodrome. Illustration from page 71, Anti-Aircraft Lewis Gunner's Darwin from a 1943 edition, khaki and green. One incalculable benefit which the gunners did pass on, though, was their enthusiasm and bravery at a time when both were desperately lacking in the town. They were young and inexperienced, but they were brave and disciplined, and they did shoot down A0. Their marksmanship improved appreciably during subsequent raids. What the gunners could not be held responsible for was the density of guns in Darwin that were expected to defend the town and the aerodrome. All the textbooks stated that an aerodrome of Darwin's importance and size should have a minimum density of 36 guns, meaning that each battery should include 36 anti-aircraft guns. Page 111. Bofors guns on the left are what they're referring to. Meaning that each battery should include 36 anti-aircraft guns. Darwin had a maximum of 8 and an average of 6. When the raid started, RAAF personnel, taken completely off guard, took cover wherever they could find it. Each man was supposed to know his position in a slit trench, but many preferred to go straight into the bush. But there was one unfortunate group of men who had no idea what to do. There were at least 100 civilians working at the airport on the morning of the raid, and the station commander had never given them any instructions as to what they should do if there was a raid, even in the 24 hours immediately before, when an attack seemed almost certain. They had been given no slit trenches nor encouraged to dig them, and they had even been refused steel helmets. Griffith said afterward that it was, quote, assumed that the workmen would know what to do if the alarm went, even that they would recognise that it was an alarm. But when he was pressed to explain what he based this assumption on, he could only say that they had probably watched the RAAF personnel during air raid practice. There had been 2 air raid practices about 10 days before the raid, but Griffith, of course, had no idea whether the men who had been at the airport on those occasions were even the same men who were there during the raid. Injuries among these men were small, but it was more the result of good luck and common sense on the part of the civilian workers than any good judgment by the RAAF. When the raid was over, Group Captain Sherger got back into his car and drove around the buildings. Apart from headquarters, most of the buildings had been bombed or machine gunned, and there were fires burning everywhere. Aircraft were destroyed or damaged, and an ammunition store was ablaze. For reasons that would become only too clear, he could see very few people around, which puzzled him at the time, but a few at least had made an angry token gesture of defiance at the Japanese. Squadron leader Andrew Swan, a middle-aged Scotsman who was station adjutant, manned a Lewis gun in one of the trenches, and with a warrant officer beside him, kept up a constant stream of fire at the strafing fighters, and about 50 others scattered around the airfield fired with other guns and rifles. One of the first fatalities, and indeed the first RAAF officer to be killed in combat on Australian soil, died firing a Vickers gun. Wing Commander Archibald Tyndall was sitting on the edge of a trench when he was killed instantly by a bullet from a Zero's machine gun that hit him in the throat. An RAAF base near Katherine in the Northern Territory commemorates his name. In a remarkable act of bravery, Swan and a warrant officer called Chapman led a party of volunteers into the blazing ammunition store and carried the explosives out to safety. In spite of the damage to most of the aircraft, Sherger found 3 Hudsons which had not been damaged, and an idea came into his mind for avenging the attack. He would order the Hudsons to take off at once and search for the aircraft carriers that he knew must have brought the raiders. At the same time, he would give instructions for all the Wirraways in their new guise of dive bombers, and some American A-24s which were also dive bombers, and which were all at Batchelor, 100 kilometres away, to be loaded with bombs. His plan was that when the Hudsons found the carrier, the dive bombers would go in to attack her. It was an adventurous plan, but there is no doubt that if it had eventuated, it would have become a suicide mission. Admiral Nagumo's fleet or the Zeros would have effortlessly destroyed every aircraft. As it happens, the planes never even got off the ground. When he came to pass the order to the Hudsons, there were no telephones working and no way of communicating his orders. Any message he wanted to pass to Batchelor would have to have been taken there by dispatch rider. Later, and long before any order had reached the crews to take off, it was found that the ground-to-air radio link had been destroyed, and without it there was no way the Hudsons could send back the information, even if they found the carrier. It was one stroke of good fortune that day for the crews who would have had to fly the hopeless mission. Although a considerable amount of damage had been done to the aerodrome, the raid was lighter than the one on the harbour and the area of the town around the post office. Even so, it was evident that it had shaken the morale of many of the personnel, who were now either wandering around aimlessly or had taken to the bush. Air Marshal Williams arrived at the aerodrome soon after the all-clear sounded at 10:40, and Sherger, who was acting area commander in the absence in Java of Commodore Wilson, briefed him as well as he could on what had happened. Even then, Sherger did not know that there had been any warning of the raid from Bathurst Island. If he had had more time, he would have gone to RAAF operations room and to the ACH, but he was preoccupied with Williams and with another VIP who was on the base, American Air Force General Patrick Hurley. Hurley had arrived in a Liberator which the Japanese had destroyed. A dense, foul-smelling black cloud had drifted across Francis Bay toward the RAAF station when the sirens began to wail again. For the people in the town by the harbour and out at the RAAF base, it was the most depressing noise they had ever heard. Exhausted by their ordeal and sweating in the tropical midday humidity, the thought of another raid had passed from their minds. But at 11:58, the watch on Platypus had spotted a formation of 27 bombers coming in from the southwest at about 6,000 metres. Many who saw the planes were convinced that the expected Japanese landing was about to take place and that at any moment parachutes would begin falling from the planes. But to their relief, the aircraft did nothing except keep flying. At the RAAF base, Sherger was still talking to Williams when he was warned that the Japanese were coming back. By the time they had walked quickly to a slit trench that Sherger had dug, the Japanese were already overhead, and now they did not just keep flying. Simultaneously, all 27 aircraft opened their bomb bays, and with a terrifying crash, their bombs all struck the aerodrome together. From the town, it sounded like a gigantic thunderclap. But that was not all, for when the men sheltering as best they could from this terrible onslaught looked up, they saw that there was not one formation but two. An identical one had come in from the other direction, and the two seemed to interweave as they crossed directly above the airfield before dropping another salvo, which landed with a deafening roar. No one at the base that day had ever experienced a raid like it. If the damage from the first attack was, as Air Marshal Williams described it, only reasonably heavy, this was a massive bombardment. There were no fighters this time because the Japanese knew that their bombers, which had crossed the Timor Sea from Ambon and the Celebes, would meet no opposition. Nor did they attempt to bomb anything except the airfield, where more than 200 bombs fell in an area 400 metres by 800 metres. It was the noise that those on the ground would find so difficult to describe afterwards, for few of them had imagined that such a noise could exist. This time the raid had lasted for 25 minutes and the damage was immense. The pattern bombing had virtually destroyed the surface of the station as well as the nearby RAAF hospital. When Major General Blake visited the base later that afternoon, he returned saying that it had been, quote, blasted off the face of the earth, unquote. 3 hours later, the hangars were still burning fiercely and ammunition and cordite was exploding everywhere. 6 Hudsons, 2 Kitty Hawks and the Liberator had been destroyed on the ground, together with another 8 Kitty Hawks lost from Major Pell's squadron. Probably by extraordinary providence, only 8 servicemen died in both raids. Probably is the word because so many people failed to answer the rolls when they were called that it was never entirely certain. One man found in the bush, for example, had been hit by a daisy cutter that had cut him to ribbons and wrapped him round a tree. There was no clothing on him and no identification. It was assumed that he was an unidentified airman because he had a scrap of blue cloth on him, but it was not a uniform. Total Japanese losses in both raids, from all causes, was probably no higher than 11, making it a highly successful mission from the point of view of Fuchida and Minoru Genda. Fuchida later described the raids as a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but the havoc they caused and the devastating effect they had on the morale entitled the Japanese to be well pleased. In the town there had been few, if any, fires to deal with because the Japanese had not used incendiaries there, and for Darwin's fire chief, Ernest Bailey, this was an immense relief because he had neither the men nor equipment to cope with many fires at the same time. He had asked the men in the town if they would join the fire brigade, but had been given a stony refusal, quote, the typical Darwin attitude, unquote, as he put it. And when he arranged firefighting demonstrations to impress on people the urgency of knowing what to do if there were fires after a raid, he counted himself lucky if 12 people turned up. At the RAAF base, on the other hand, where incendiary bombs had been dropped, there were fires everywhere, and Bailey knew that the firefighting facilities there were, quote, hopeless and completely inadequate, unquote. Only 2 days before the raid, he had inspected them and found 9 hydrants that were totally useless. He had asked for them to be removed so that in an emergency people would not run to them thinking that they would find water there. But Griffith never even acknowledged his written request. There was not nearly enough hose for fighting the fires, and the fire engine, which had not been properly protected well away from the base, as he had continually suggested, was a burning wreck. A warrant officer had responsibility for fire training, but Bailey had never seen any training and had no knowledge that any had ever been undertaken. After the second raid, a civilian plumber working at the RAAF base, Charles Jacobson, was one of the first to try to put out the fires, but when he went to hook up a hose, the pressure was so low that the water only trickled out of the end. He then rushed to find the Air Force plumber and asked him to turn on the emergency supply in the big water tank that dominated that part of the camp. The plumber, however, said he couldn't do so because it was not his function. Instead, he did agree to turn on the water from the bypass which came from off the main supply to Darwin, and while he did this, Jacobson went to turn on the emergency tank. But when he got there, he found it locked with a chain and a strong Yale lock. Again, he ran to the plumber, but he didn't have the key, and all he could remember was that, quote, a man in the tower, unquote, had it. This too proved abortive, and after wasting nearly 10 valuable minutes, Jacobson smashed the lock with a hammer. The RAAF did not have the facilities to repair the damage to the aerodrome themselves, particularly where tradesmen were required. They could not even repair the bomb craters. The arrangement that had been made was that the Public Works Department would immediately step in after a raid and have essential services repaired within hours. What happened, in fact, was that nobody went near the aerodrome for a week, and for all that time, water, electricity and telephone services were either completely destroyed or not functioning. Had there been another serious raid, the RAAF, as the General had graphically put it, really would have been wiped off the face of the earth. Even as it was, the American pilot who arrived to take General Hurley out of Darwin described the raid as the most complete job of destruction he had ever seen. Perhaps, if one is clasping at straws, this might explain what happened next, for in the absence of proper leadership there was a near stampede, as officers, non-commissioned officers and aircraftsmen alike ran away. They ran so far and so fast that days later hundreds of them had still not reappeared. It was primarily the result of bad leadership and bad communications, but it was also, as an observer noted in his diary, quote, Australian servicemen at their very worst, unquote. The word cowardice was pointedly avoided, but for many of those who turned tail and fled, it would have been very close to the mark. There was a great deal of panic after the first raid, but it was the second raid coming so quickly on top of the first that was the last straw. There had been an hour and a quarter between the first all clear and the second alert, but this had only sensitised many people to another raid. When the second raid was at its height, few of them had ever imagined that they would experience anything so fearful. Well, let's call a halt to part 10. More to come.